Well, it's definitely true. Warhammer 3 is bleeding players. Darren from Republic of Play has given us a useful look at the data, and it's clear people are dropping off faster from Warhammer 3 than any other Total War game in recent memory. So let's discuss why. Is this a big deal? Should we be worried? And is Warhammer 3 going to be catapulted into the sun to join Three Kingdoms in a dishonorable death that came far too soon? One thing is very obvious right now. The general sentiment is that people are not happy with the Realms of Chaos experience. They feel it lacks replayability, that it doesn't give players enough agency to play how they want, and instead are railroaded into minigames and end-turn simulators within the Dark Gods playgrounds. The narrative aspects work fine for the first couple playthroughs, but Total War isn't a story-driven game that you play just once. It never has been. This isn't God of War or Assassin's Creed. You want to try out every faction, every lord, different kinds of starts, different kinds of strategies, different methods of expansion. And the problem with the Realms of Chaos campaign is that it funnels your playstyle into a specific set of tasks over and over and over again, which means on your 5th, 6th, and 7th campaign, even if you're playing wildly different races, they end up playing similarly because you're undergoing the same objectives in Sinesh's Realm or Khorne's Domain over and over again. You lose that sandbox element, the ability to go where you want and do what you want, because your legendary lord, no matter which faction you're playing as, has to go into the Realms of Chaos, tying up your most important and most entertaining character and army for the majority of your session, which is to say nothing of the time spent convalescing afterwards, getting rid of negative traits in your capital cities, and just the general busy work that comes with this experience. The core gameplay is build super tall and turtle like crazy, and much of your time spent realm jumping just amounts to end turn spamming, which is hardly a scintillating experience. So ultimately, it feels like many of the criticisms leveled at the Great Vortex campaign in Warhammer 2 weren't fully taken on board in designing Warhammer 3. That maybe not enough lessons from Game 1 and Game 2 were learned properly by the main design team in Warhammer 3, which honestly covers a whole suite of issues here, from anemic and downright useless tech trees that I thought we'd move past at this point, to hilariously bad lord skills and traits, and obviously plenty of gameplay bugs, from the supply lines mechanic not working properly, to unit responsiveness suffering from a slew of issues, impact damage, all that, tons of issues, back and forth. There's a lot going on here. So let me be clear, I don't fault Creative Assembly for creating a narrative campaign. If you're going to create a gigantic sandbox experience like Immortal Empires that will be bigger than the Game 3 exclusive campaign in every way, it makes sense to build something different. Otherwise, it will completely be forgotten about the moment the combined campaign comes out, because it's offering the same experience with much less content. So creating a narrative, story-driven baseline is logical. But if you remember back to the Tomb Kings or the Vampire Coast, or any other number of DLCs for Warhammer 2, CA stopped forcing factions to interact with the Vortex narrative because it interrupts the sandbox elements that attract so many players to Total War. And the Great Vortex was never as intrusive or unpleasant as Realms of Chaos can be. Even they knew that a railroaded experience that may work great in a prologue doesn't necessarily translate as well to a gigantic map that players should be encouraged to explore. And a strong, story-driven campaign doesn't have to mean railroaded gameplay, which is one of the biggest problems as it stands currently. Already, we're seeing mods that allow you to disable the Chaos Rifts, and the introduction of the Mod Workshop should alleviate many of those core issues, but we should never rely on mods to make the game what it should have been from the start, and so from that standpoint, the slow patching process can be a bit frustrating. Before we go any further, let me just say I'm having fun with Warhammer 3, as I have been since early access. The game is very flawed right now, there's no denying that, but there are tons of elements that are incredibly well done and deserve praise, and I think that sometimes that gets lost in the echo chambers on Reddit and TW forums. There's a lot of melodrama going around, plenty of it is targeted and logical, some of it not so much, and we'll talk about that in a minute. I can't speak to the drastic performance and crash issues some of you have been facing because most of them haven't been a problem for me specifically, and that is something people need to realize is that just because you haven't experienced an issue doesn't mean hundreds of other people haven't already. And for those of you who are experiencing those problems, you have every right to be mad, except for maybe the turds running 30-year-old graphics cards and expecting to play the game on Ultra, which happens more often than you'd think. But yes, even on a system as powerful as mine, there are still graphical and performance issues on my end, and those are things I talked about in pre-release. The northern regions of Kislev and the area surrounding Glut Port running worse and worse as more rifts open, more enemy agents spawn in, and more of the map becomes revealed. The obnoxious and incredibly ugly flickering issues that are on a decent amount of maps. the horrific SSAO implementation in shadowy snow areas or the deserts of Cathay, and the poor performance of Cathay battle maps in general. There are some battleless Cathay maps where I literally get 40 to 45 FPS before the units have even loaded in, which is completely unacceptable on a 3080 and i9 9900 KF. Just not even remotely okay. So without question, there are plenty of issues facing Warhammer 3 right now, and that is playing a large role in why the player base has dropped 75% in the span of 3 weeks. Am I shaking in my boots, incredibly worried about the future of this franchise and of my YouTube channel? No, not really, and I'll tell you why. Number 1, February 2022 was an absolutely wild month for games. If you think Warhammer 3 has the ability to compete with juggernauts like Elden Ring, you would be incorrect. My entire friends list is made up of Total War players, and at any given time, more than half of the people that are online are playing Elden Ring right now. At the time of making this video, it has 600,000 active players that are currently getting their asses kicked in-game by bosses. And then we remember that Horizon Forbidden West, Dying Light 2, and a whole host of other heavily anticipated titles also launched this month, and it really shouldn't be all that surprising. Remember also that Warhammer 2 had higher peaks with Warden and the Punch and Silence and Fury than it did on launch day, significantly higher, and these games tend to get significantly better throughout their life cycle. Yes, the Three Kingdoms debacle should never be forgotten. Dropping that title because of self-inflicted wounds was a horrendous look on CA's part, but when it comes to the Warhammer series, patches like the Potion of Speed update that massively improved turn times, campaign mechanics, start positions, and general gameplay, it just all gets way better over time, which means people are in this series for the long haul. So if you think this is some unmitigated disaster that players are dropping off right now, well, it's not a great sign, I'll give you that. It's hardly the death knell of the franchise either. In a month this stacked with games, people are going to play a few Warhammer campaigns, then wait for a patch and or Immortal Empires, because the combined campaign has always been the main goal. People will experience a couple playthroughs, see the full story, try out some of the new mechanics, then wait for the big kahuna. And that is when I expect the title will reach its zenith, once that full map is made available and all your beloved factions are back in the game. Of course, that also puts a tremendous amount of pressure on CA, because they really can't afford to screw up the initial launch and the reveal of Immortal Empires, which is why you should strap in and expect a significant gap between now and when that combined campaign will drop officially. People were kind of laughing at me when I said it might be a 6-month gap or more, but the reality is it's probably quite a bit closer to that than it is to a 1 or 2 month gap like it was for Warhammer 2. Like I said in my Immortal Empires video, take your freaking time and make sure it hits the right notes straight from day one, because you can't go back and change the initial reception to Realms of Chaos, but you can make sure Immortal Empires kicks off with a bang and not a whimper. But I will say, one of the slightly annoying aspects of all this drama is the sheer amount of misinformation that gets spread, as people look for anything and everything to latch onto as the reason why Warhammer 3 isn't as good as it should be. Like, we can and should hammer home all the problems and make it clear to Creative Assembly what needs to be fixed. That's how Warhammer 2 grew to be such an amazing game, and why it improved so much from Warhammer 1, but we can do that without literally making shit up. And when I see these threads about De Novo not being installed on early access builds, and the Realms of Chaos campaign being built on a pre-Potion of Speed update Warhammer 2 version, and they're getting upvoted to the top of the front page and dominating the conversation for days at a time, that is a bad look. If you're planning on making a Doom thread that is a damning glimpse into the development of this series, and your only evidence is conjecture and hearsay, you should probably think about not posting it until you have something a bit meatier to back up your claims. If you have frustrations, share them, but spreading incorrect or downright false information doesn't benefit anybody. It just gives you a misguided outlet for your rage. Stop it. Get some help. Now, as for the Legend of Total War rants over the last week or so, I fully empathize with where he's coming from. As a fellow content creator who puts a lot of time into making videos, when a release does much more poorly than expected, and there are bugs and glitches aplenty, it makes us harder for us to do our job, and directly impacts our bottom line, which is not fun. I agree with his overall sentiment that Warhammer 3 is not putting its best foot forward right now. It clearly has problems, some of which directly affect my job, and that annoys me. I am fully on board with his frustrations. Legend's ultimate point, that on your 10th or 15th or 30th playthrough, that the Realms of Chaos mechanics will simply not be fun, rings true for the majority of players. There are pieces of feedback we left in early access that should have just been numerical changes, that could have improved the game, and to feel ignored on those elements is also frustrating. I get where he's coming from. But I also think there's a decent amount of melodrama in those posts, and a lot of it stems from the fact that every second of his existence is spent on this freaking game. Here's the thing. Legend needs to take a goddamn vacation. The dude spends all of his waking hours playing Warhammer 3. It's not healthy, it's not reasonable, and it gives him a warped mindset. I don't care how much you love a game. If you spend 1,000 hours on it in the span of a month, you will grow to despise it. You will see all of its flaws, and you will get irrationally angry at them. And that can make it difficult to objectively look at the problems the game has, diagnose them, and provide rational feedback. CA does listen to what content creators say. I can give dozens of examples of things that I myself have suggested or brought attention to that have been changed or fixed. And of course, that's true for the community as a whole as well. Torox and the Beastmen rework would have never happened without people speaking up. But it's naive to think that in 30 days, any developer on the planet would be able to make sweeping changes to the core features and gameplay loop of a campaign as big as this one. So when he says that he made himself available and that all his feedback was ignored, I think it's naive to believe that they could have made such sweeping changes in such a short time span when they're ultimately just trying to make the launch itself as smooth as possible. I shudder to think what would have happened if they had attempted major changes a couple weeks before launch. My bet is that performance, crashing, and campaign ruining bugs would have been even more prevalent than they already were, which is why the final weeks are generally spent just optimizing and tweaking the little things. It's just not something that's worth getting personally offended about, that they weren't able to implement all your feedback in a handful of weeks. Again, it doesn't excuse the lack of lessons learned during the lifecycle of Warhammer 2, and it doesn't even remotely excuse the bugs, performance, and design flaws. But for most of us, a lot of these issues only became truly apparent after a couple weeks of playing or watching. It's when that honeymoon period ends, and you've had enough time with the game that the flaws become more readily apparent. And to anyone saying, oh no, I knew about all these problems from the second I booted up my first campaign. Well, no shit. You were watching and listening to us for a month. You had a much better idea of what to expect and a better understanding of the flow of a campaign on your day one than we did on our day one. Which is why Legend gave the game an 8 out of 10, even though that doesn't really match up with his current perspective on how he feels about it. That it would, and I quote, easily be a 9 out of 10 game without the Demon Souls mechanic, and then in the same post he says that it's almost Rome 2 launch levels of bad, which is utterly ridiculous. Rome 2 had one of the worst launches in gaming history for a title as anticipated as it was. Warhammer 3 is not even in the same goddamn dimension as the Rome 2 launch. So again, it's no shade to Legend. I get where he's coming from. I'm with him on a lot of points, but I saw so many posts on the subreddit about him and his rants over the last few days that I just wanted to get my own perspective in there as well. Ultimately, the reason I'm not worried here is that despite all the bullshit and the what the F moments, CA has a proven track record of massively improving and supporting the Warhammer series post-launch. That does not forgive or forget the self-inflicted Three Kingdoms wounds they made, the fact they dropped that series because of their own blunders with DLC and post-launch support. Do not forget that. That should always be at the back of your mind. But we have done this exact same song and dance a dozen times over in Warhammer 1 and Warhammer 2 and in the run-up to Warhammer 3. And to put it simply, I am confident this game will get the help it needs, that the player base will bounce back quite nicely, and that the final product with Immortal Empires and all factions will be worth the wait. I'm still having fun with the game. It's far from perfect, and it took some steps backwards from the end game of Warhammer 2 that I really don't understand, but I'm in this for the long haul, as I'm sure many of you guys are as well, and we can move forward from here. Keep your feedback coming. As Legend said, hold them to task, and I think we will see Warhammer 3 blossom into a beautiful flower, even if its roots may have been a bit uglier than we wanted initially.